Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the Arturia Emulator 2V tutorial mini-series. There are going to be two videos in this series. Today we're going to talk about the basic architecture of the synthesizer and get a good working understanding of how everything hangs together. In the second episode we'll dive a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole and have a look at some advanced stuff. If you enjoy these videos, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Awesome way to help support me, carry on making content like this. Okay, let's make a start. I've dialed in this sound called progressive lead. This is what it sounds like. Pretty indicative of the kind of sound that you get out of the emulator. It's a really analog sounding, warm, rich engine. Surprisingly so for an early 80s sampling workstation. You'd expect it to be quite brittle really, because sampling workstations were in their infancy around this time. But the emulator was famous for being a warm sound because large parts of its circuitry were still analog, including the output circuitry. Obviously all of that's being emulated by Arturia, but I was really surprised when I was getting to grips with this thing just how warm it sounds. We have a resonant low-pass filter to play with. Here's the filter circuit, and there are multiple layers of this filter. What you see isn't necessarily what you're going to get. If I turn the frequency knob, this is going to change the cutoff frequency of the filter, so I'm going to set it to 1 kilohertz. Now, ordinarily, in our spectrum analyzer, which is this box down in the bottom right-hand corner, if I press a note, you'd expect to see a peak at 1 kilohertz, but it's nowhere near 1 kilohertz. It's up here, closer to 4 kilohertz. That's because we've got some additional modulation. I'll cover how all of that works in a moment. Let's just hear the filter doing its thing. This peak is where the resonance control is taking over. So resonance boosts or accentuates the frequencies at and around the cutoff. Now, the reason why that boost isn't happening where this frequency knob says it should be happening is because there are a couple of additional layers that are being added onto this filter that we need to be aware of. The first is that it's velocity sensitive. So depending on how hard I hit the key, you're going to get a different filter sound. If I press the key very lightly, or harder, and that's being controlled from the velocity control knob. Let's take that away, and now every time I press a key we get a cutoff point at the same frequency, which is where my mouse is, about 780. Still nowhere near where the knob says. The next layer that's being added onto this filter is a filter envelope. So this is an additional layer of modulation that's coming from these 4 controls: attack, decay, sustain and release. Now, envelopes are most commonly associated with the amplifier. We'll have a look over there in a moment. And in this particular preset, the filter envelope is non-zero. See that number, say 27.6. The filter envelope can be either positive or negative. It's going to adjust the frequency cutoff in a dynamic way. I think the simplest thing to do is to set it to 0. Double-click any control in any Arturia product, you'll set it back to its default state. And for this particular knob, that's at 12 o'clock, which is 0. Let's press that note again. Now, finally, we have a filter cutoff frequency at what the knob says it is, 65 Hz. Now we have a much wider range of this low-pass filter, because it's operating over the entire frequency range. Set it to about 1.5 kilohertz. Now I'm going to reintroduce the envelope by turning that control back up again. So I'll press the key. Here's our cutoff. Let's go negative. What's basically happening is that a shape is being drawn by these controls, and how big that shape is, basically how much impact it's having on the filter, is being controlled by our master envelope knob. So what's actually happening when we come to rest on this envelope is it's the sustain level that you're hearing. But the whole idea of an envelope is that it's a journey over time. So if we introduce some attack and decay as well, now we're going to go on a journey with this envelope. And And here's the filter cutoff, taking us on that journey. Up, back down again, and we settle out at the sustain level. And the more we push these controls, the longer that journey will take. Let's turn the envelope back off again. Another way that we can play with the filter is with our low frequency oscillator. The LFO controls are in a section of their own up here. And what the low frequency oscillator will do is move the cutoff frequency up and down periodically over time. The speed at which it does it is controlled with the rate. So that's cycling 5 times a second. It's the same as doing that with my frequency cutoff knob. Every control on this synth just sounds amazing. Let's turn that off again. And finally, we have the ability to control the frequency cutoff from what key we play on the keyboard with our keyboard follow. So now when I play low notes, we're going to get a different filter cutoff from when I play high notes. See, the cutoff frequency is all the way up here, around about 8 kilohertz now. Generally speaking, you want to introduce key follow when you want a more natural feel to your filter, because it's going to track with the pitch of the note that you're playing underneath. So a little bit of keyboard follow is very often a good thing. The third of the major components is the VCA. This stands for voltage controlled amplifier. This is basically our volume control. So at the moment, every time I press a key, you get an instantaneous sound. But if we introduce an attack into the VCA, this introduces a slope. So we're going to start off at no volume, and over the course of 1 second, we'll get to whatever our maximum volume happens to be set to. Now at the moment, our sustain level is at 1, which is as high as it can go, but we can actually go all the way down to 0 volume, which means that we'll spend a second getting loud and then we'll instantaneously go back to 0. I'm going to press a key. Now I've still got my key held down, but the sound's gone because our sustain level is at 0. The note is still playing in the background. That's me manipulating the VCA with these controls. The decay control sits in between attack and sustain, and it determines how long it takes us to get from one to the other. Up through the attack phase, down through the decay phase, and we finally settle out at 0. And the release control determines what happens when we let the key go. So let's have an instantaneous sound. I'm going to let the key go now, and it fades out gradually because we now have a release cycle. Just as with the filter control, we can tie the low frequency oscillator into the amplifier. Here's our LFO control. Now when you apply low frequency oscillation to the amplitude or volume of a sound, it's generally called tremolo. And as I turn the LFO control up, it's the depth, the amount by which that volume is going up and down. The rate is always the same. We're controlling the amount or depth with our LFO knob. And finally, we have a velocity control. How much do you want to affect the volume depending on how hard you hit the key? So turn velocity control all the way up to maximum. I'll play a key quite lightly. You can hardly hear it. And there's velocity sensitivity. The third thing that the low frequency oscillator can do is control the pitch of the sound. That's generally called vibrato. Slow it right down. The delay control on the low frequency oscillator specifies an amount of time over which there is no oscillation, and then it basically gets introduced. The best demonstration of delay is with tremolo, because you quite commonly have a note played, starts out static, there we go. So the sound started out stable, and then we introduced our tremolo. We have a built-in arpeggiator. Let's turn the arpeggiator on. I'm going to play a C minor chord. Let's make it go over 2 octaves. We have different patterns that we can play with. Let's go up and down, only playing the extreme notes once. So exclusive means you only play the lower and the higher notes once. Inclusive, it means you play them both on the way up and on the way down. Exclusive is far the more common of the two. Now if I start introducing other notes, it's really easy to make arpeggiators sound just very musical. My basic C minor, or the minor 7, perfect 5th, minor 3rd. We're just adding extra notes into the chord and it just all sounds great. Turn that off. The Emulator is an 8-voice polyphonic sampling workstation, which basically means you can have 8 independent samples playing simultaneously. Now you can't see this information from the primary interface, you have to go into the advanced screen to do it. So let's go there. I'm going to click in the monitor, and down the left hand side you can see the voices in use by this preset. In fact, there are 4 of them. 4 of the slots are empty, so this is a 4-voice sound. Now, so far throughout this demonstration, all those controls that I was changing in the main interface were affecting all layers simultaneously. That's because they're linked together. These little link symbols are doing the job. So here's another representation of the filter cutoff. It's exactly the same control as the one you saw in the main interface. When I move this, can you see those controls glow down the left-hand side? It's basically telling you that all of the layers are being updated with this new value. If I take one of the voices out of the linking, now voice number 1 is no longer linked to the other 3 voices. So now when I turn the cutoff knob, that link symbol isn't there. So I'm only changing the cutoff there for voice number 1. A little bit difficult to tell that because we're hearing all 4 voices simultaneously. Let's solo the sound by pressing S. And now we can just hear voice number 1. I know it's white on white, it's a bit unfortunate, but voice number 1 has just been soloed. And there it is. Let's have a quick run through the other voices in this sound. Here's voice number 2. Now I just made a mistake then, but it's a happy accident because it gives me an opportunity to explain that what you see isn't necessarily what you're editing. I wanted to edit layer number 2, but I've still got layer number 1 selected. This frequency cutoff that you can see here is the frequency cutoff for the currently selected voice. I can only hear layer number 2. But this is the cutoff control for layer number 1. Don't want to hear that. You'll have to forgive me if I use the word layer in the place of voice. Sometimes they're synonymous. I should say voice. Now we're operating on voice number 2. So that's just voice number 2 that we can hear, but again, it's linked with all of its other linked siblings. So when I'm turning this control, I'm changing the cutoff frequency for all of the linked layers, even though you can only even though you can only hear one of them. Here's voice number 3. Now here's something interesting. There's voice number 3. I'll play a C. And here's voice number 2. 5 semitones apart. If we go back over to voice number 3, it's been transposed down by 5 semitones. So effectively, we're building a perfect fifth here. We're building a power chord with all of these different voices. The fourth voice is transposed up 7 semitones, which is basically the same as going down by 5. They're an octave apart, and we're generating a perfect fifth power chord here. Here's the square on its own. All of those controls that you can see in the main interface are all available here as well. So remember, there were 3 different places where we had control of the low frequency oscillator. We had LFO control of the filter, LFO control of the amplifier, otherwise known as tremolo, and finally LFO control of the pitch, which is called vibrato. So this is simply a more comprehensive view of what you're seeing through the front end. This is what the physical device looked like, but there were obviously menus that you could drill into in the clunky early 80s way that you could. A lot of that's just been cleaned up, made much more accessible in this master interface. I'm going to jump back up to voice number 1, solo it. What you see in this window is a representation of that wave. This is a sample that's being played. When I press a key, that strobing line tells you the current playback position of the sample. You can also see from this loop icon that the sample will play indefinitely as long as we've got the key held down. The play direction tells you how it will be played back. So we're just basically going to loop around. Once we get to the end, we're going to go back to the beginning and we're going to loop. I can change the play direction to make it go forwards, then backwards. I can edit both the loop points from these lower triangles. So now the loop will just go around in this zone. And I can also edit the start and end points of the sample with the upper triangles. So now only this portion of the sample will be played. I can change this sample for a different sample. Click the browse icon, and now we have a whole list, a massive list of different factory samples that we can choose from. Let's have a string sample. That one will do. If you double click, it takes you back to the editing interface. Now we have a string sample instead. All of the other voices have been unchanged. If I take it out of solo mode, now this string is going to play along with the other sawtooth and square voices. You can also import your own samples into the emulator. We'll have a look at that in the next episode. I'm going to load up a new preset now called Emulator Vocals to show you another example how multiple voices can be used to generate a single sound. See these 2 JX10 classics? I'm going to solo them both. This is what it sounds like. What you're hearing there is a stereo sound generated by 2 separate layers being hard panned. If we select voice number 2 has been hard panned to the right. So if we just listen to that and I press a single note, so over here, and voice number 3 is hard panned to the left. Bring them both in. This is also a nice example of multiple different sounds being used to generate one composite output, because the North Sea sound is the sound of water, and the Fizz-Mod vocal sound just sounds like that. One other quirky little thing about this preset, when you're deconstructing presets, you come across all sorts of stuff. This second instance of Fizz-Mod vocal is identical to the first. When I'm doing preset deconstructions, I very often toggle quite quickly between 2 separate sounds. So as I'm kind of jumping backwards and forwards over that layer, I'm looking for things that catch my eye, and it's pretty obvious that there we have the pan, but with the fizz mod there aren't any. This might just be an artifact of the preset design. It's very easy to duplicate voices in the emulator. You simply click the copy button, and then it gives you this down arrow. Where do you want to paste it into? Put it over there. Just generated another copy there. So it's entirely possible that the preset designer for this particular sound did that and then didn't edit it. It might be, for instance, that they wanted to pan those two sounds left and right. I've got this spurious one at the moment that I just created by that duplicate process. If you want to throw this sample away, just press the little trash can icon. That voice has now been initialized. So if we set the left and right pan for these fizz mod vocals, we might just have finished off that preset design. And now we've got stereo fizz mods. Over on the assign page, we specify how each of the voices is mapped in two different metrics. One of them is which keys generate this sound. This is with our keyboard layer, so we can pick up the left and right anchors and change the range of the keyboard over which this sound is going to be played. And we can do a similar kind of thing with the velocity, specify a limited MIDI range, which MIDI velocities, in this case 43 to 69, will generate this particular voice. We'll have a deeper look at the assign page in the next episode, but I'll just give you a quick example of the kind of thing that you might come across. Let's have a look at the Garage Foley kit. Here we've got different samples being mapped to different key ranges. So when I press a key, I'll just press a random G3. That's playing Foley kit 6, as opposed to D3, which is playing Foley kit 5. Let's have a look at what that sound is. As opposed to. So we've basically got 8 different sounds of a drum kit mapped across the keyboard using these assign ranges. Much more to explore in this plugin, but we'll leave it there for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much.